see that we have, almost the same amount of observers as we do participants on this panel. So that's always a good sign, and I'm sure more will be coming in. It is quite crazy at security at the moment with this new, with the new week starting here at COP28 in Dubai. My name is Laura Pereira. I'm an associate professor at the Global Change Institute at Wits University in Johannesburg, and also research at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and I'm the co-PI of the Future Ecosystems for Africa program that is funded by Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation. And it is under those auspices that we're here today to have this panel, which is almost like the COP process, adapted and shifted and changed over the past week, as we realized who's in town, who's able to make things, who has some time to spare on this important Friday morning. So this is going to be an informal conversation. The focus of this discussion is really about data needs, science needs, the role of science from the global south, in particular Africa, but across the global south regions, to feed into negotiating positions. So like how we need to improve our data, our social science, the way that we're able to provide evidence for decision making across climate. So obviously we're focusing here on COP, on the UNFCCC, but also how we're starting to look at some of the interlinkages around biodiversity, around the ocean, around livelihoods, justice, equity, etc. So I've got a really amazing panel that somehow we managed to convene with me here today, and they all have sort of different areas of expertise that they come from, whether it's across sort of sectors, geographies, or just organizations. So what I was going to do, I was going to start off the conversation just by posing a question to each of the panelists, and it's really about your reflections on COP thus far, sort of the discussions that you've been having, some of the connections you've been having. William, you only got here yesterday, so you can see what your aspirations maybe for COP are going forward, sort of what you'd like to see from that perspective. And I'll just do a brief introduction of names, and then you can sort of talk more to your specialty, or how you would like to present yourself to the panel. So the far end over there, I've got Amir Sokolovsky, who's the Director of Climate Change Director at CDP. I've also got Dr. Odorilwe Selomane, who is based at the University of Pretoria. I've got Dr. Patrícia Pinho, who is based at IPAM in Brazil. I have Dr. Sibel Queiroz, who is based at the Stockholm Resilience Center, but is with the Global Resilience Partnership. And on my left, I have Professor William Chung, who is the director of the Fisheries Institute at, the Ocean, yes. Oceans and Fisheries Institute. I should know that you are a good collaborator of ours. So if I start with Amir, and maybe we work this way, and then we'll just open up for general conversation and questions from the audience.
Start with me as an introduction, or as a temporary answer to the question? First of all, thank you for having me. Second of all, absolutely the wrong side to start. I have, as CDP, I have a simple message, and it's only one, unfortunately, although, as Laura knows, I can make it complicated. For those who don't know, and it's most people, CDP is the only integrated global platform for collection of data from the private sector, from cities, states, and regions. We collected this year 68% of global market capitalization, reported to us approximately 24,000 companies. The reason I give those stats, other than the fact that I have my team here, and they should know that I give those stats, is also to say that what we're talking about, what I'm going to say now, is reflected in the way the private sector behaves as far as we are concerned. So what's my simple point? What's the problem, and how does it get into the negotiations? Financial flows depend on certainty. It's how our system works. It's actually not how hard something is, but how certain we are that we know exactly what it is. Financial flows, when they come to climate, are dependent on a very particular, especially in the private sector, on a very particular way of reporting information. That information has well-established criteria already. So you have to have a certain risk assessment of what happens. You have to have a strategy how to incorporate that risk assessment, and so on. When it comes to the Global South in general, but explicitly when it comes to Africa, out of 24,000 companies, CDP had last year 184 reporting to us, And this year, I think it's 210. And the problem is always capacity, but not necessarily capacity to fill in a report. If you go to Norway or Brazil or China, you'll have scientific evidence that your company can base a reasonable assessment of risk on. If you come to many countries in Africa, many regions actually, you'll find that many companies have to reinvent the wheel, which presents to them a risk, a litigation risk. It presents to them a financial risk. It presents to them also a lack of certainty in whatever they'll come up with. So that is invisible to this process. UNFCCC will occasionally mention non-state actors and will occasionally mention parties, not occasionally, always mentions parties in financial flows, forgetting that nation-states are a fictional being, much like corporates are, and they're comprised in many cases of the private sector within them. And if that private sector is unable to respond to a lot of the needs of the financial flows that it is defining, then that private sector will receive absolutely no finance. How do we get it into the negotiations? The global stocktake obviously should mention not only non-state actors, but the building of capacity of the private sector to report for financial sectors. And that exists a little bit in a sentence here and there in quite a few places, and of course there's CBET. Within adaptation finance, within all directions of finance, there has to be special treatment in this context. As always, I overspeak. I'm happy to speak again afterwards. I'll put the microphone down for now.
Yeah, so I think over the past few days here at COP, there are several threads of things that I thought were interesting, both for specifically for us, let's say at FIFA for the work that we're doing, but also generally for this topic. And one of which links to what Amir was just talking about now. That I was at a session on Wednesday talking about biodiversity finance, and one of the key things that was discussed there was the sector understands or has a perception that there are no projects to finance, and the project side is talking about the lack of finances for this project. So there seems to be a mismatch. So one thing that really jumped at me there was a sort of like a need to coordinate this, sort of a matchmaker for these two sides. But another key element, which I guess also links to the risks that you're mentioning, Amir, is also providing the science to provide the baselines for things like, in our case specifically, degradation. So within FIFA, what we have been doing is looking at several decision tools that are used to decide on sort of restoration projects that will be linked to restoration and all the sort of nature-based type of approaches. And there are our criteria is looking at what is the basis for the data that these tools are based on? Is it reflective of our continent in this case? So if we look at a global degradation map, is it reflecting the ecosystems that are on the ground? And how can we improve these maps in a way that they provide the correct baselines based on the correct ecosystems and context for where we are working? So that's of course one aspect of mainly providing the baselines for where to work from. But there are many other, I think, similar approaches that are really the core of these is to bring context into, you're looking at a global map, but what is really happening? The projects that are implementing are happening on the ground, so they have to reflect that context. And we are approaching it from how can we support this process with science, with research, to develop these baselines.
So first, thank you for organizing this panel. And I think this is something that should be happening more and more at COP. I think we keep talking among ourselves. And so I think in this debate, I come from a region where it's already mentioned, it's a country, Brazil, high, unequal, but I work mostly in the Amazonian region, which I think faces many of the challenges we are seeing, observing in the African continent in some aspects of the region. So I also am part of the IPCC, and then in the process, we have been suggesting and gathering data that on invisibility, that on people's on impact of people's life, but also how we can like leapfrog development patterns that has been already proved to be harmful, not only for the environment, as we are mentioning, but also for climate and livelihoods. In that regard, I think we should be, in my vision, for instance, in the Amazon, we have been already having this monitoring system for deforestation rate, forest degradation, that can be really linked to the science that in the African continent can also support. In terms of the finance and the risks, what I keep seeing, it's really this differentiating process within the negotiation. So I'm following closely the global adaptation, the global goal on adaptation, and how those invisibility is still not really picked it up, and people keep talking, especially when we're thinking about who are in charge of supporting us in terms of the finance. So they are not differentiating those in terms of high vulnerability, but also because the private sector and the finance sector keep saying the high risk that it is to invest on those regions, right? But again, if we don't start investing right now, these risks are gonna just keep up, and then increasing, I think, the gap that we from where we are and where we needed to go in the near future.
Yes. So thank you so much. It's really nice to hear all the different perspectives. So hi, as Laura said, I'm a researcher at Stockholm Resilience Center, but I'm also here with the hat of the Global Resilience Partnership. So I lead the knowledge work at the Global Resilience Partnership. And I think many of the things that I wanted to talk about really touch upon some of the things that you said. We have been doing in the Global Resilience Partnership, like over the year, we have been doing this sort of regional dialogues for sort of with the goal of sort of discussing how to come to implementation of like resilience and adaptation, and how to bring sort of local voices up to the global negotiations. And we have these regional dialogues like in Asia and in South America and in Africa. And it has been really interesting to see how, despite many things, and especially when it comes like to how to implement things, they are quite different across the regions, because we do have like very different sort of governance structures. Like it's very different from Asia to South America, for instance. But also like how many of these things are common, right? And we still see, it was interesting, we had a quite interesting discussion on sort of, you know, how to bring those local voices up. And it's really challenging, actually. It's very challenging to go just like from like what are local cases and examples, and bringing up, you know, a wider participation and sort of those voices up to sort of global policy processes. And so I think we need to know a little bit more, and we also had a session on Wednesday where we were discussing about this, and I've seen this discussion in other sessions, which is like, we talk a lot about like cross scale and about scaling up and about, you know, but we don't actually understand these words and whatever we are talking about. And I think there's probably just 2 points I wanted to touch. And it's like, one is about what we mean when we are talking about scaling up action. Do we want, everything doesn't need to grow. I think that it's something that there is a diversity of local approaches, and they are diverse because they're also context dependent, and they're also like culturally dependent, and this is a good thing. So, you know, it's not that we need to replicate things, you know, in different places. I think it's much more about enabling capacities that actually already exist, but that they might be blocked, you know, due to certain factors. And I think there's a lot of discussion around this, and we start to think much more on what is actually building capacity, local capacities, and if it's not a lot about building that cross-scale connection. So like, you know, how do you actually bring those voices up to sort of larger scale decision making processes? There are capacities there, both for the larger scale actions and for the local communities and local actors. And so I think we need somehow to start having these conversations more, and also to actually do more research about it. Yeah, I had other things, but I think I will let, we have time.
Thanks. Thanks for having me to be in this panel. It's really exciting to hear the views from my other colleagues. And I think I just arrived yesterday, but I've been following the discussions in this COP before I came here, and it's just really exciting to me to hear about the declarations, the joint declarations about climate change and health. I think that this is a really important connections that really need to highlight in the whole climate change discussion, and particularly the linkages of both the impacts of climate change on health and the interconnection between them. And then it relates to a lot of the interconnecting step because health is interrelated to biodiversity, is interrelated to food, particularly biodiversity and food linkages, and that's something that myself and my colleagues have been working a lot in our research. We have international partnership projects that Laura is also a PI of our projects that focus on finding solution options for solving the sustainability challenge of climate, food, and biodiversity nexus. And that's really related to these climate, biodiversity, health, food linkages. And it poses a questions and challenge about how to make decisions, how to develop options that can then tackle these bigger societal challenges that are interconnected to one another. Because right now, a lot of these discussions are happening in silos. We have this COP that talk more about climate change. We have CBD COP that talk about biodiversity, and we have other venues that talk about food security. But we need to bring this together. And so I think one of the needs is to find ways to do that at different scale and levels, from the international levels down to the local levels. And in our projects, we do that through a series of case studies. So for example, we have case studies in West Africa, in Ghana and Nigeria, working with colleagues there, trying to look at climate change, but then interconnections with other threats on the local food security, such as illegal and unreported and unregulated fishing, and how that affects the availability of fish to coastal people. And this is an example of the data needs, the gaps of knowledge, and also challenging us to develop a decision-making framework that can allow us to link these different decision-making platform together. So, for example, when we think about climate solutions, when we think about, for example, blue carbon, restorations of mangroves, and things like that, how does it also support food security? How does it also support biodiversity, and vice versa, like protected area for biodiversity, but then it also have benefits to climate change and also providing food as well. So I think this is something that I really hope to continue to see more in the ongoing discussions in this COP, as well as in discussions after this meeting. So thank you.
Thanks so much, William. So, I mean, what I'm starting to see emerging from the panel discussions, which is always quite interesting when you sort of bring a group of researchers from very different areas, researchers and practitioners, that there is this fundamental need to talk about these interconnectivities. And I think when you look at the Global South, it's impossible not to think about the interconnectedness between food and biodiversity and climate, livelihoods, etc. And yet we have these intergovernmental processes that are extremely focused on specific issues. So UNFCCC is carbon, it's greenhouse gas emissions. This is sort of the sole focus. CBD is on biodiversity. BB&J, the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, is sort of ocean focused. And yet they're all connected, but we kind of, I don't know, I find myself running around like a headless chicken in all of these processes, kind of saying the same things, but nothing actually tends to change. But I do think that there's potentially a power in these intergovernmental science processes that a lot of us are involved in. So, you know, what we keep on hearing everyone coming back to is the science says, right? And when there was that entire discussion, and, you know, feel free to also talk to it on phase out, sort of the need for phasing out fossil fuels by 2050, which we all know to be true. Coming back to what the IPCC report says, and CBD, it comes back to what the IPBES reports say, and there are a bunch of us who are authors across those. Is that the place for us as researchers to start to get more of the information around local knowledge systems, around this to make more visible the invisible that you were referring to, Patty? Is that the route? Are there other mechanisms that we need? Does the finance business sector even take these reports into account when they're starting to think about decisions? Or are there other ways? And I think in particular, maybe thinking through the role of the media, because sort of the only conversations I've really been having have focused on phase out of fossil fuels, that it was picked up, and that is a discussion. It's not about the health aspects, the wins that we're seeing there, the fact that, okay, we now have loss and damage, the fact that actually the global goal on adaptation is almost dead in the water at this point, right? Which is something that we really need to be considering. Why can we not agree on theme-based outcome targets across different sectors? There's something happening there. So any thoughts, reflections, jump and have a conversation amongst yourselves too.
As a mere practitioner at the table, there are so many points that you've raised, as you know, and they're like, everything I'm saying I'm going to regret immediately the second I put the microphone down, so I apologize in advance. You mentioned the phase out and the phase down, and you mentioned, or versus the phase down, you mentioned the scientific articles. I'm going to start by answering a very simple and direct question. And once a lawyer, always a lawyer. Everyone seeks certainty, financial institutions more than anything. If they have a scientific paper upon which to say, well, this is in accordance with science, they're delighted. What we need to remember, however, is that in many cases we're bringing a knife to a gunfight. It doesn't matter how many times we look at the person on the other side and say, this knife is a gun. It is not a gun. And I'm going to go from an analogy that we all recognize and empathize, and I'm going to say something a little bit controversial in order to come back to exactly the position. If a strategy isn't working, no matter how morally correct it is, no matter how amazing it is, if you want to get to a result, you need to change your strategy. In that context, the answer that phasing out of fossil fuel is not part of the hard science is technically true. And if you're fighting a battle with the media and you're insisting on something that is technically an addition, then you've lost the battle. Instead of saying, that's not what we said, there were a few excellent answers to that particular statement. So, I mean, and I think that is reflected at the local stance, right? We come up to this and we don't say, here are the reasons why. We say, here are the reasons why for just transition, and the science says that. No, the science says X in order to arrive at that. Something we all know in this room, but is never reflected in the interconnectedness of the system as it works. A second thing around the system is, you're talking about thematic negotiations. And I had to speak to my team about what is COP, because we're an NGO, but we're associated with the private sector, so it's not necessarily common knowledge. And it was a shock to a lot of them to discover that the COP negotiations, or CMA negotiations if you want, are negotiations that are result-based. Adaptation, mitigation, now loss and damage, and finance. And it's the role of the presidency in each one of those to bring the themes and spread it across. And that alone is not understood. So I'm not necessarily speaking as a practitioner, but as an ex-negotiator in this particular instance. As a practitioner, I will say that the more you try to insert particular science, the more you lose from the private sector point of view. banks, financial institutions reporting to us report around particular elements of climate, around 82%. Beyond climate, which is what we know the world is walking towards and which is what this discussion is, they report 24%. And they don't do that because they don't want to. They do that because there is no methodology that they can stand in a court and say, or in front of an investor or whatever, and say, this methodology assesses not only the science, but the things around the science that El-Jabbar was referring to. And this is a pathway that, while it's not perfect, is reasonable and agreed by the scientists. And the last, absolutely last point before I put down my microphone and regret it, is within the negotiations, there's a massive gap between epistemic communities on both sides of this COP. Within the negotiations, the needs of the private sector are not at all recognized. And I don't say that as necessarily a capitalist or anything else, but recognizing that I'm at war, here are my instruments, private sector is one of them. The way the private sector behaves influences the negotiators and sometimes the presidency. They're not abstract. If they don't have the tools, then the presidency or the negotiators, depending on where you are and what you are, remain in positions where they last stopped and knew. So we have to focus more on the subnational in this context and bring not the results of the subnational, but the methodology of engagement on it. I hope that made sense, and I'm sure a lot of it didn't, but listen to others.
I have a lot to respond to that, but we don't actually have to go back in order. But
So this is not a response necessarily, but it's to pick up on a point you were saying earlier about adaptation failing in this COP, and it's for me. So it brings maybe three things that are in a way maybe four actually. So I have mitigation, I have adaptation, and I have land-based things. I'm just going to call them that, and then because there you have also food and some of the things that are discussed on the margins of COP. So what is curious about that is that the emissions that if you look at let's say if you look at Africa and take out South Africa, say for now, the emissions are actually fairly low. So the mitigation there is well, maybe what's needed actually mostly is adaptation. Because people are dealing with the impact, not so much that they need to be reducing huge amounts of emissions there, but if the focus is on mitigation, it's and ignoring the adaptation side of things. This is also an interesting prioritization of whose mitigation is it in a way. So that could be a question. But I think on the land-based thing, I think a lot of the discussions have been focusing a lot on, I mean, even in this very room, I guess because South Africa, we're dealing with 75% of the emissions coming from electricity, so it's focused quite a lot on that. But we still have 10% of emissions that are land-based or are fully based that are not part of the discussions in some ways. So that also, for me, is an interesting omission that I've observed here. And what is, maybe to connect back again, maybe to your point, I think one of the things is that, to use South Africa as an example, is that carbon projects have moved on quite a bit. There's still a lot of uncertainty, as you say, but they have managed to have some level of certainty that maybe biodiversity projects might not have, at least in the form of returns for private sector. But if we're also focusing on public sector, their returns should be different. And so it can't be motivated necessarily always by the same things that motivate the private sector. So I think for that reason, and I'm fully with you that for moral reasons, these are not enough. But adaptation for the public side of things, I think, is a moral imperative in a way, and could be approached from that perspective. Otherwise, if everything is going to be with a return on, if all the decisions around climate are made with, I want to get something in return, it's going to be a very tricky space, I think.
Well, I will just continue on this ambiguities. I think what we are witnessing at COP, I mean, many COPs, but specific this one. So For instance, the IPCC mentioned that countries with under high vulnerability that are sitting mostly in the global south have like a mortality rate 15 times greater than countries that are said developed and usually sitting on the global north countries. Nonetheless, we have a first victory of this COP, or one of the success was in the first day on the operationalization of the loss and funding mechanism, right? Nonetheless, on the negotiation room, on the adaptation goals, developed countries are attempting, and that's why it's so slow, to withdraw the commitments of funding they have agreed upon on the Paris Agreement. So what's going on there, right? So we have the science evidence, we have already witnessing the materialized impacts and risks happening in regions and people and ecosystem that have over the time least contributed to all those earth systems disruption, if you will, and we still attempting to really pretend that we are using the science or the best scientific information we have to make a change. On another aspect that I want to mention is the high confidence that the scientific community has said about phasing out fossil fuel by 2050. And yesterday, or 2 days ago, the president of Brazil, which has been flagging that is, rejoined the Paris Agreement, is committed to halt the deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon that we know lies partly of the solution to the global climate crisis, are attempting just joined the OPEP and is planning to exploit petroleum on the falls of the Amazon region. So my point here is we really need, as a scientific community, specific from the global south, to get strong enough and united to really make a change and position ourselves to those critical ambiguities and try to solve that as soon as possible. I don't have an answer to that, but one of the reasons why I'm here is to trying to sort it out and provide some sort of input into this debate. I'm not sure, it's just like I'm more provoking than providing answers, but I think that's the goal of our conversation here, right?
We're following the order anyway, right? Yeah, so I guess we not always have the answers, right? And I think it's also fine to admit it. This is a journey for us all, right? Like both practitioners, private sector, public sector, scientists. The truth is that there's a lot that we don't know how to do, and we need much more science and evidence on that, I would say. And I think I wanted to go back to a bit what you said about also about how the whole COP process works, and about, this is something that really bothers me, it's this division between mitigation, adaptation, and then you have financing as the sole pilar, the sole enabler of all the mitigation and adaptation action. As a resilience scholar, I have to say that this makes no sense to me to distinguish between mitigation and adaptation. Resilience is about the capacity to be able to face change, such as climate change, the capacity to cope with it, to adapt to it, and to transform when it's needed, so that we actually can address the very drivers that are causing those changes. So it's a much more dynamic view, and I think that that siloed view that we need to deliver goals in each one of these, transformative change is normally absent, I would say, from all the sort of policy negotiations. I was surprised to see that in the stocktake report, it was actually a call, a quite ambitious call for transformative change that is still in the document, says nothing about how we are going to do it. So I was scanning through the document yesterday, and I think that at least as much as I saw, like the only thing that has a little bit of more concrete suggestions on how to act or how to enable action was actually the mitigation part with the phasing out of fossil fuels. That, as we all know, is also extremely contested, like all contested, I mean, by different parties. But it is the only thing. So there's no sort of, it feels like if we are blind when it comes to, what can we do to actually address the drivers of the changes that we are seeing, and that if we would be able to do it, then we actually wouldn't need such big adaptation efforts. We wouldn't need, to reach particular levels of global warming. So, and I think that there is a lot of science. It's not about, for instance, transformative change. I mean, it's not, in a way, I feel that it's still a bit in its infancy, despite we do have a quite solid body of research that it's building up. But I think that there's a need to sort of invest much more in that type of knowledge. Like, how can we actually, promote change that is transformative, even in very difficult contexts? And this is some of the conversations that we also have been having more in sort of side events, sort of at COP, but about how to sort of enable these types of transformative change. And assuming that even in contexts, as you were saying, that, that are sort of affected by like food insecurity, conflict, climate change, right? Many times like the reaction is that, well, then these communities need immediate support and relief, and that is true, but this needs to come side by side with efforts for actually transforming what is wrong. Because otherwise you just keep having situations of lock-in, like, all the time. And then I will shut up. I just wanted to say something also about the private sector and about the science. And I think that, I was thinking about what you said. I don't think it's true. I don't think that the private sector reads scientific articles. I think that you need to translate that, and you need to engage with them. So there's a lot of science that exists and that doesn't come through those actors. We have been having in the Global Resilience Partnership engaging, for instance, with business schools, like we're trying to sort of, they are interested in starting to include more sort of like social ecological resilience in their curricula, which I think it would be great, because then maybe we could start thinking about, other ways of sort of transforming the economy, for instance. But it's really difficult to have those conversations. It's really difficult to be on the same page because the languages are just so apart, right? And so there's a lot of translation work and a lot of sort of work of putting everyone in the same page that needs to be done. But I do think that we need to do that work. And as scientists also get out of our comfort zone, and finding and also understanding what are the needs from, because I do see in many of the private sectors that we have been engaging with that there is the will of how do I do better? Like, I mean, of course we see a lot of cases of greenwashing, but we also see a lot of cases where there's a sort of a genuine will of wanting to include social ecological resilience, wanting to address climate issues, wanting to, and I agree with you that it's sort of the how, it's still very difficult for those companies. Sorry, you can respond to me.
I know you haven't spoken yet. I swear it'll be one sentence. First of all, sadly, I never said they read them. I said they depend on them for lawsuits. So they just say they align, and those are not the same thing. I'm sad to say those are not the same thing. And second of all, a lot of scientists come to the private sector and say that they need translation. I very much respect your point in saying it's not a translation. Actually, they need to understand. So where a climate or an environmentally mission-driven NGO. But when I come to a company and I say these are the things that need doing, they say, well, I don't exactly understand how IPBES or IPCC translates into actual action for me as a private corporation. The UN has spoken about this Article 6 thing, but I'm not allowed to offset. Why not? Some fair, some less fair questions, but there is an act of more than translation, of us understanding that we actually need to understand what it means on the ground. Sorry, I know it was you, Sam.
No problem. Yeah, a lot of my colleagues already mentioned some of the very important points that I also would like to contribute to. I think there are a couple of things that I want to build on and further highlight. I think I agree with the point about the both in terms of the need to have the science as an independent voice to make sure that there are important aspects and in the discussion of climate change that needs to be raised. And I think there are really, and I think that's the role of scientists, and that we have that independence in our research and our development of thinking, and also the findings that are generated from those research that then communicate that to the decision makers, to the public, about what our science tells us the important issues that all these international and national discussions needs to incorporate and discuss. So, for example, the oceans is the ocean scientists have solid evidence that shows that the ocean is a very important part of the climate discussions, both in terms of mitigations as well as on adaptations. But one of the things that sometimes frustrate ocean scientists is that a lot of these climate discussions does not even mention about the oceans in many of these discussions, even though the oceans cover more than 70% of the Earth's surface, and that many people, particularly coastal communities, particularly the vulnerable communities, particularly in the global south, are dependent on the oceans for food, biodiversity, and for their climate actions too. But then I think it is our role to then provide the science that highlight this aspect and continue to support that in this negotiation and discussions. But at the same time, I think I also agree that we need to work with the stakeholders, the business, government, to understand what their needs are in terms of supporting their actions, supporting their discussions. And that co-development of knowledge is really important. And I think this has become more and more mainstream now in a lot of the research, particularly in some of the works that we've been doing, looking at this space about connections between climate change, food security, and biodiversity. So, for example, we have been working with at the more local level, coastal indigenous people, trying to understand what they need in order to develop climate adaptation measures. So that I think that have lots of advantage in both understanding or developing research that would really tailor their needs, as well as making sure that they have full interest in actually utilizing those science that we could develop together. And I think that's an example that would scale up to a higher level at the national, international levels, working with transnational cooperation and things like that. I think that would also applies as well. And that's something that my colleagues also mentioned earlier on that I agree.
Thanks so much, William. Do we have any questions from the floor? Otherwise, I have a ton myself that I want to ask. And maybe even be that really bad facilitator who's going to go on a mini side diatribe of her own, but you guys know me well enough to have expected that or anticipated it at least. But these are also sort of posing final questions, maybe to each of you to take into account. We've got about 13 minutes left, so maybe we'll do a final round of answering those and sort of final reflection so that we have enough time, not the usual 10 seconds to sort of wrap up. So Amir, you've brought up this idea of certainty and the need for certainty. And I think that is a really important word, because I've got a climate sort of modeler, fisheries expert on my side, and I think certainty is is a really difficult term when it comes to models, right? So how does science actually provide that certainty when we know the levels of uncertainty in our models and understanding our own systems are quite variable, right? And so you were referencing that, the science, the technical aspects when it comes to phase out is, was emphasizing that, yes, it's not actually that certain. And that was the loophole, right? There was a really good loophole that we were able to say, well, actually, getting a little bit technical now, but the two model sets using the shared socioeconomic pathways, which are underlying assumptions of how basically the world could work in the future. And there's one, SSP1, which is on sustainability, which is basically how we need to start doing adaptation and mitigation well. And there are two sort of bodies of scenarios of how to achieve 1.5, and one of them which achieves 1.5 with sort of a bit of overshoot before coming back. And basically, the science is showing with the specific models that are running those that, getting to 1.5 now is not going to be, it's not feasible under those scenarios. So this idea of overshoot and really trying to avoid exceeding as little as possible before coming back is the body. But, and this is my question to you, William, because you know these underlying models, you know these assumptions. We're talking about transformative change. There's no transformative change in any of those underlying assumptions, right? In any of those sort of storylines of how the world could look or how the world needs to look in order to still be able to achieve 1.5, and even the sort of the connections in the integrated assessment models that drive that. So, in terms of the type of science, particularly from the South, that we can be bringing different narratives of what that transformative change could look like, feeding it into models, and it might take some time, but potentially there's an important role of the science from this sort of group to be able to actually say, well, sorry, IPCC, yes, sort of, you had the best at the time that you were using in your reports, but we've actually got alternative ways of how this idea of transformation can actually be incorporated, because that's really where the science is. It is sitting, unfortunately, at these fuzzy boundaries of we're not really sure how much the Earth system can actually absorb, right, before it's unable to take up any more of the carbon that we're putting out. And a report we recently released on tipping points was also talking to all the potential cascading implications as if we do exceed some of these thresholds, what we might be starting to see that's irreversible, right? That we need to avoid as strongly as possible. But potentially there are also mechanisms for positive change, for positive transformative change coming out of that. So Sibel, maybe you could talk a bit more to this idea of tipping points, of the equity justice, of the sort of bottom-up nuanced context that we need to bring into these global negotiations. So yeah, certainty is a question, like, are we able to push back on that? Because we know that we're dealing with the future. It's always going to be uncertain. And is it about building capacities to improve people's capacity to act despite uncertainty? And I wanted to put, not yet, but I want you to put your legal hat on.
Now.
When you respond to that, Amir, dear. So contemplate, think on that. There was a powerful message that I think Philippines is the head of the G70, is sort of heading up the G77 in China in the negotiations at the moment. And in the report back on the Loss and Damage Fund, which we all know is completely inadequate when you look at the numbers of sort of 400 million that's been contributed now. Those subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies, are sitting in the trillions. I think daily profits from the oil industry is also sitting at 1.7 trillion or something like that. So orders of magnitude different. So that's also something to really flag in terms of the financial inequities. But he mentioned that 7 out of every 8 people on this planet are represented by the G77 in China, right? And I think that's powerful, right? That's really, really powerful. And maybe, Pachi, you can talk a little bit to the power that comes within that. Not you yet, Amir. You will have your chance. I'm going backwards this way.
It's a broad use of the word represented, but yes. Are
based in those countries, right? Are geographically based in those countries. Representation is always a flawed term. I don't want you to put that much of a legal hat on. So I think, yeah, the power behind being the majority world, right? Is there something in that we can actually utilize to shift some of these narratives onto more just and equitable pathways? And then Odie, the public-private sector divide that you were also talking about, we've spoken quite a bit about what the private sector needs in terms of making decisions. That's quite often where the action actually sits, right? And we're seeing these investment flows coming into the African continent for particular kinds of carbon projects in particular, but we know we can also leverage them for biodiversity in good ways, but they could also be quite detrimental and almost this cause more cascading negative impact. I'm just going to raise my voice a lot louder to try and overcome whatever's happening in the room next door before I pass on the mic. So maybe talking to these the difference between the private sector needs, but then the public sector understanding that we need to enable that kind of change because we know these sorts of processes are slow. So yeah, those are my key questions. Certainty models, can we do better? Legal hat on in terms of uncertainty and potentially transformation. These are scary words, right? They're not something that you can sort of put a fine-tooth comb to, and we've set up an entire process around that. The idea of what we need for the private, what we need for the public, the capacity to act, this idea of incorporating transformations, transformative change, what kind of science can we do better to be able to actually incorporate that in these sorts of processes, and particularly this role of the South, like the power that we might be able to have. So I'm going to start with Patty, then I'm going to go to William, then I'm going to go to Amir, then Sibel, and then Odie, finally to you. Great.
It's great, Laura. I think like you touch on a critical question about how, both like uncertainty and data comes when we are talking about policy influence and decision-making process. So for one side, I see a lot of people say they cannot take any action, especially in the global South, because we are data deficient, right? And then when we get enough data, they talk about the high uncertainty that we have to act. So then we got stuck on that venue as well. So then I want to pick it up on the example of the power we have as like global South countries who has, of course, many differences, but lots of similar colonial trajectories. And we know that colonialism has been at the key front of how climate risks has been experienced or in the actions that are limited to really foster what we are seeing, what we want as transformation, right? So we needed to treat that and then leapfrog and then see if we can get into a process that we can transform. To answer, like, I don't have a final answer, of course, but one example that I think it's very powerful, it's what I have been witnessing with the AUDR legislation, which is the anti-deforestation legislation that has been approved by EU countries that are like pledging that they are not allowing any products that comes from the global South or from tropical forest to enter their market, right? And what I have been seeing, it's a huge pushback from countries that are the exporters to the EU market of saying, yes, we have like technology, we have means to comply, we have a process to comply with the legislation, but nonetheless, we want acknowledgement of the good practice that we have been witnessing in terms of sustainability, reducing climate risks, and improving livelihoods of those that are there. So, of course, the process is still blocked, but because there is this huge pushback of global South countries who has the forests and then needed to address. Another issue that in my region is important is the own process of the Mercosur-EU agreement, which is also showing the power of the global South in like pushing back process and trades that are not equal, that are highly demanding on process of or nature, that we cannot afford anymore to emit more greenhouse emissions in agri-trade as we thought when we envisioned this trade 20 years ago. So I'm not saying that this is like a smooth process, but what I'm saying is that there is this huge power behind what just Laura said, the high percentage of people that are part of G77. So China is also pushing for, in a very less clear manner, the sustainability pathway, and especially like the process of carbon leakage in countries as like Brazil or Africa. But we really are seeing that slowly, but hopefully this COP can pick it up and make it faster, because we don't have much time, right, to really act if we want to keep the temperature in a relatively manageable way. So, yeah, thank you.
Thanks. So I will talk a little bit about more on the science and the uncertainty aspect, particularly in relation to some of the things that are relevant to the climate change mitigations and adaptations. And we know that there are uncertainties with all the steps of understanding the physical science, the impacts, and also the mitigation and adaptation solutions of dealing with those impacts. I think it is not, it is the uncertainty that is, or whether it's high uncertainty or low uncertainty is most difficult to address, because we know that if we can quantify and or understand the uncertainty well, no matter whether it is low uncertainty or high uncertainty, there will be, we can develop processes that to deal with the uncertainty. There are decisions or there are policy or strategies and tactics that are geared towards more of things that are uncertain, or vice versa. But I think in this case, some of the most challenging part is some of the unknown in kind of the scientific terminologies, where there are things that we haven't yet built into our models or in the understanding. For example, some of the climate feedbacks and how much it is either positively exacerbating the effects of climate change from greenhouse gas emissions or vice versa. And those are the things that are most difficult to deal with, because basically we don't even have that as part of our radar in the policy discussion. There were, for example, debates about whether how much of the oceans would help with or contribute to climate mitigations, and those are the things that I think would really require continuous scientific research, as well as trying to actively think about all these kind of potential unknown uncertainties in building into actively thinking about that in developing kind of scenarios around thinking about futures and decision making. And that also is something that relates to some of the, for example, the new ideas or new developments of scenarios for climate change. So Laura mentioned about so far there's been lots of use of the shared socioeconomic pathway, SSP, in a lot of the climate assessment for climate modeling. But then the IPCC also recognized that there were gaps within the SSP, for example, the feedback between adaptations, mitigations, changes in human behavior, and some of the transformative changes that are not yet incorporated or not yet explicit in those SSP. So early this year, the IPCC convened a workshop to bring together the scientists, social scientists, and decision makers to think about what needs to be revised or redevelop in these scenarios in order to better capture those kind of uncertainty. So I think that's hope in there.
Perfect. Thanks so much, William. And I'm being told that we unfortunately need to stay down. Thank you so much, everyone. We can continue these conversations going forward. Thank you.